Good afternoon. I am Gregory Washington, the president of George Mason University, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to Russia's war on Ukraine in a historical perspective. Our Russian and Eurasian Studies program developed this 12-part series as part of a course Mason faculty are teaching on Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The goal of this series is to present the work of 12 scholars and writers from around the world. Their insights help us to understand the historical relationship between Russia and Ukraine, the invasion itself, and the remarkable resistance of the Ukrainian people. Through the perspective of these historians, we are better able to comprehend the war in Ukraine in a broader context. This series is an illustration of how humanities research in a public research university can create knowledge, spur discussion, and expand understanding of complex global issues. We appreciate your viewership of this series, and we are proud that George Mason University can bring it to you. Enjoy.
Well, thank you, President Washington. I'm Professor Steve Barnes of George Mason University. My usual assistant, Jessica Dotrieve, can't be here today as she experienced just what you might expect for someone from New Orleans, just not where you'd expect it. She's in Nova Scotia, where they are still without power, though thankfully safe and sound. I want to welcome you to the third in our ongoing series as I invite you each Monday into my online classroom for History 388, Russia's War on Ukraine in Historical Perspective. One goal of that course and these events is to explore how history allows us to better understand this war. To do that, I've invited historians whose work has helped me to make sense of the senseless and to understand the remarkable resilience of the Ukrainian people. And few contribute more to that effort than today's guest, Professor Serhii Plokhii, whose now quite well-thumbed volume, The Gates of Europe, is here just over my left shoulder. These events are made possible due to support from the program in Russian and Eurasian Studies, the Department of History and Art History, the College of Humanities and Social Sciences, and the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute, all parts of our George Mason University community. We're trying to build an online discussion of the events in this series on Twitter and invite you to use the hashtag RWOU for Russia's war on Ukraine to share your reactions to any of our speakers and explore my Twitter feed with that hashtag to find links to some of the readings and films assigned in this course, including a couple of great interviews with today's speaker. To further the discussion, I'm pleased to announce a new series, Russia's War on Ukraine and Its Consequences for the World, a weekly Q&A, starting this Friday at 3 p.m. Eastern. Last week's Monday speaker, Professor Cynthia Hooper, came to my Wednesday online class for more Q&A, and the conversation was so outstanding that it revealed to us a need to meet not only in this format of speakers with some time for Q&A, but also to have a more open format weekly chat. So Cynthia Hooper and I have set up a format where audience members will be able to ask their questions directly and engage in conversations with us and each other. I'll share a link to more information in the chat shortly, but I do hope you'll be able to join us. Well, what a week it's been since we last gathered. We had the Putin speech that was, then wasn't, then was again, announcing a so-called partial mobilization that seems likely to maybe be 1.2 million men rather than the originally announced 300,000. Then the lines of cars at every conceivable open border as Russian citizens try to get their young men out to avoid conscription. We had significant evidence that conscription is hitting ethnic minorities in Russia at a higher than average rate, in a fashion some are calling almost ethnic cleansing. We only saw small bits of protest, though with some pockets of promise in places like Dagestan. We heard an outraged denunciation of Putin's war by the president of Mongolia. And we read Ukrainians understandably aggravated that Russians only resist and protest when mobilization might impact them, not when Russia launched its invasion 7 months ago, not to mention its war for the last 8 years. We saw President Zelensky urging Russians that it was better to resist conscription than to, quote, die in a foreign land as a war criminal. And how can we not mention the so-called referenda, already denounced by much of the world, and in reality, simply garbage PR stunts and public humiliation of occupied populations inflicted at gunpoint. The war itself has taken a bit of a backseat in the news this week, but it grinds on with some hopeful signs of continued Ukrainian progress on the battlefield. So at this moment, it's important that we continue to support Ukraine. And I'll ask you again to write to your governments urging continued support for Ukraine, and that you consider making donations to Razum for Ukraine, which works on the ground in Ukraine to provide humanitarian relief and recovery assistance. I'll provide more information in a moment. As I tried to make sense of this war, I turned to our guest, Professor Serhii Plokhii. Watching lectures and interviews he gave and reading some of his absolutely voluminous writings, Professor Plokhii is the Mikhailo Khrushchevsky Professor of Ukrainian History and the director of the Ukrainian Research Institute at Harvard University, which has, by the way, organized a live address by President Zelensky tomorrow at noon. I'll add a link to information about that event as well, so you'll be able to watch it online. Professor Plokhii is the author of so many books that I noticed even his Harvard faculty bio page can't list them all. His most recent is Atoms and Ashes, A Global History of Nuclear Disasters. Let's all hope there is not soon cause for a second edition. Please submit your questions at any time using the Q&A feature on Zoom, and I'll ask as many as I'm able after Professor Plokhii finishes his talk. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Serhii. Serhii, can you hear me?
First of all, thank you very much, Professor Barnes, for this introduction, organizer, and honor to be part of them. What I'm going to talk about is certainly the historical perspective on the war in Ukraine, something that fits well the series as a whole, but also suggests that probably some of the overall issues and themes that I'm going to discuss maybe have been discussed or will be discussed in the future by other speakers. I hope that if there will be any overlap, the overlap will be in a form of really adding to the information, adding to the perspective on the issues. I will share with you my screen, and so that you wouldn't be bored by looking at me alone. There will be a number of images that will illustrate the specific parts and sections of my presentation. So I'm now trying to move the page, and okay, now it worked. So for those of us who were interested in history of Ukraine and studied it for a long period of time, looks like that last year, in the summer of last year, we were all surprised to find out that there was one more historian of Ukraine and one more historian of Russia. And it was the Russian president, Vladimir Putin, who published in July of the last year an essay on the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians. And from what I hear from my colleagues, the likelihood is that he actually drafted most of that essay, not just added his name to it. Whatever the contribution of others might be to the essay, there is no doubt that its main argument is the one that was presented by Vladimir Putin, at least since the year 2013, the year before the start of the current war in Ukraine and the Russian aggression against Ukraine. And that argument is quite simple. It is that what Putin has been saying for a long period of time, that Russians and Ukrainians were one and the same people, and the essay was an attempt to provide a historical justification and legitimization for that for that particular argument. In that sense, the history is really written all over this war and this most latest stage of it that started in February of 24. But I want to say that the history is present in the way, not in the way how it was misread and misinterpreted by Vladimir Putin. What is important to understand about his take and perspective on the history of Ukraine and Russia and relations between the two nations is that it was not just an attempt to justify the aggression, the future aggression. It was really a representation of Putin's personal beliefs and thinking, which also served as the basis for the planning of the military attack on Ukraine earlier this year, when the assumptions were made that Kyiv would fall within a few short days, that Ukrainians, because they are part of the same nation, would welcome Russians and Russian army with the flowers, and finally that there will be overall desire of the Ukrainian people, as now Putin tries to prove through the shame referendum, to unite with Russia. Because when Putin was saying that Russians and Ukrainians were one and the same people, he didn't mean that Russians were really Ukrainians. What he meant was that Ukrainians were really Russians. So we are experiencing here a return of history, and that's the title of my talk in a number of ways. It's not just about Francis Fukuyama and his argument that in 1991 or in late 1980s, history had ended because of the emergence of the liberal democracy as the most powerful, almost without alternative form of government and form of political philosophy. The history returns also in a different way, as a history of the disintegration and collapse of the empires, the process that world has been experiencing for at least last few centuries, at least starting with the American Revolution, and certainly the process that picked up a lot of speed in the 20th century. In the course of World War I, disintegration of the major empires like the Ottoman and Austria-Hungary, after World War I, and then the fall of the British and French empires after World War II, of the Portuguese Empire in the 1970s, and eventually the fall of the Soviet Union, Yugoslavia, and Czechoslovakia, the multi-ethnic states, where the process of nation building was frozen for a while by the authoritarian communist regimes. In this presentation today, I will focus on a number of different factors, historical factors, that contributed to the current war. And I will look at them and organize this presentation chronologically. So I will start with the history of imperial collapse, something that I just alluded to, and the history of the empire. I will continue with the importance of the rise of nationalism in the territories of Russian Empire and other empires in Eastern and Central Europe, and how they influenced the Russian-Ukrainian relations. I will continue with looking at the role of communism and the Soviet experience in that regard, and then conclude with the current war and the post-Soviet transition to the place that we still are not sure about what that place will be. So overall, again, it will be a chronologically organized discussion focused on the empire, nation, communist, and post-communist transformations. What you see here on this in this image is a moment of the construction of the monument to Prince Vladimir of Kiev, or Volodymyr in Ukrainian. The interesting element in that picture is that the monument is being constructed not in Ukraine and not in Kiev. It is being constructed in Russia, in Moscow. And 1 year after the annexation of the Crimea in 2015, it would be installed and then officially opened with the participation of Vladimir Putin in the most coveted place in the Russian capital, across a few hundred meters away from Kremlin, the tallest statue to any figure in the capital of Russia today. But this tallest sculpture and figure is a figure of the prince who ruled not in Moscow, whenever visited that place. It is dedicated to the ruler of Kiev. And that monument in itself really points to an extremely important really confusion that exists in the mind not only of the Russian political elite, but also of the Russian public in general in terms of the origins of Russia. There is a number of reasons why the monument ended up in the center of Moscow. One of them is that Prince Volodymyr or Vladimir of Kiev was, of course, the namesake of Vladimir Putin himself. So it is very much a monument to Vladimir Putin as a major figure of the statue of the importance that goes beyond Russia and certainly includes Ukraine and Belarus and so on and so forth. It also suggests that the Russians strongly believe that their roots, their origins are not in Novgorod, let's say, not in Moscow per se. They are in Kiev. So it would be roughly the same situation if you would see the monuments to the Roman emperors being installed in London, for example, or in Paris, and reflect the idea that the Brits are really not sure about their identity, about the borders of their state, or the French for that matter, or the Germans, but really think that what has to happen in the world, what was there before, that the unity of the Roman Empire has to be reestablished, and it is their goal and their mission in that world to go back to Rome, to conquer it, and to establish the unity, because otherwise the identity of Brits or Englishmen or French or Germans or Spaniards would not be complete. Where does this idea come from? It comes very much from the imperial history and imperial origins of the formation of the current historical mythology that exists in Russia, and that is certainly shared and articulated in the most aggressive way possible by the president of Russia today, Vladimir Putin. The idea that Russians and Ukrainians were one and the same people was really not born in Moscow. It was born in Kiev in the 17th century. And the idea that there was a connection between Moscow and Kiev was not absolutely new to the Russian elites before the 17th century. But the major points at that time and emphasis were made on the fact that the rulers of Moscow, the rulers of the Vladimir Suzdal Principality before that, they were part of the Rurikites, of the dynasty. So there was a dynastic link and dynastic connection with Kiev. And that was the most important part, the dynastic connection, the connection through church and the church structure, the literary language, and so on and so forth. But in the 17th century, when the Muscovy starts its movement toward the west, the movement eventually would bring the Russian troops to Paris in the 19th century, to Berlin and Vienna and Prague, of course, in the 20th century. But that movement starts really in the year 1654 with the Russian, not yet empire at that point. It was still the Grand Duchy of Muscovy, taking over control over the Cossack Hetmanate in Ukraine with the center in Kiev, and being engaged in the long war and protracted war with the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth on the one hand, and the Ottoman Empire on the other hand for the control over those lands. And it is at that point that the learned monks of the Kievan monastery in Kiev put together a text which was called Synopsis. The first printed text, which was in Church Slavonic, the first printed text of history that in the late 17th and the beginning of the 20th century, and at the beginning of the 18th century, becomes the only printed textbook of Russian, and the most popular one, of Russian history in Russia per se. And they introduced there the idea that was quite novel for Muscovy at that time, the idea of nation. No one in Muscovy thought in those terms, but the Kievan monks were part of this broader debate and broader discourse that involved Eastern Europe and Central Europe, where ideas of nation and patriotism were important, had important significance. And they tried to make an argument that the Tsar has to protect the Orthodox monks of Kiev, not only because of religion, not only because of dynasty, but it has to do that because also of the common ethnicity and common nationality. And it is there in Kiev, so the Ukraine from that point of view is important not only because Kiev was the capital of the Kievan Rus, but also that became the birthplace of this idea of the commonality based not on the religion, not on the dynasty, but based on nation and nationality. And the Russian Empire accepts that notion, that idea in the 18th century when it starts the process of nationalization of itself. So it positions Russia and Russian identity against the identity of the collective West, in opposition to Europe, and the idea of what the Russian scholar Alexei Miller would call the big Russian nation is being really born already around that time, 17th, 18th century. Alexei Miller writes about 19th century, but the origins of this idea are much earlier. What the 19th century witnesses, and that's where I am going from the sole focus on the dynasties and the building of the imperial structures to the next section of my presentation focused on nations and nationalism. So 19th century, this is the period of the rise of and mobilization of national identities in Europe in general. It's Western Europe, it's Central Europe, Eastern Europe, Russian Empire, you name it. The 19th century is the age of the revolution of nations. It's the age of the rise of nations. And one of the most popular formulas of how you define nation at that time becomes the German one, the Herderian understanding of the nation, where the nation is in one way or another linked and connected to the culture and to the language. And it is then at the beginning of the 19th century that the Russian imperial writers and thinkers face a very, very disturbing situation. They go, let's say, from St. Petersburg or from Moscow to Kiev, which is called in the chronicles the mother of the Rus cities, to look for the origins of Russia. And they start talking to people there, and those people don't understand Russian because they speak Ukrainian. It's a major crisis in understanding what is nation and where the origins of Russia are and were at that point. So at the same time, you see the Ukrainian political and cultural activists are working on publishing the Ukrainian folklore, the separate Ukrainian grammar, suggesting that there is a different language. And when it comes to the Belarus, another East Slavic republic today, and certainly nation in the process of the formation of the 19th century. You see also the cultural activists working there as well, doing the same thing, publishing local folklore and trying to write in the local language, in Belarusian. So by the mid 19th century, the Russian Empire responds to the rise of the non-Russian nationalism, especially among the East Slavs, in a number of ways. One of those ways is repression. So for 40 years, the publications in Ukrainian language are forbidden in the Russian Empire. Its import from the other parts of Europe, in particular from Austria, Hungary, where in one of the provinces in Galicia, there is an active Ukrainian movement at that time. So the import of those books is prohibited. So the idea is actually to arrest the development of the alternative to Russia, other East Slavic identities, languages, and cultures. So try to on a certain level, to kill the Ukrainian and Belarusian modern nation projects even before they were born, or at least before they became strong enough. So that is, the repression is one way to deal with this Ukrainian problem and Ukrainian issue. Belarusian is less pronounced at that time. Ukraine is a major challenge. Another one is to find the way to accommodate this rise in nationalism, and that's where this picture of the three sisters of bigger Russian nation of Russians, Little Russians, and Belarusians. Little Russian stands for Ukrainians, Belarusians for White Russians. That's where the idea is born, where the argument is that, yes, there are linguistic and cultural differences between these three groups, but they're non-important, they're secondary. There exists a three-partite Russian nation consisting of the Great Russians, Little Russians, and White Russians. And that is the degree of independence or autonomy that the Russian Empire allows Ukrainians at the time of in the second half of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, leading to World War I and eventually the revolution of 1917. So when you look at what Vladimir Putin writes about, this is basically a reflection of the ideas, Russian imperial ideas of the Russian thinkers and writers of the second half of the 19th and the first decades of the 20th century, where the existence of Ukraine is not completely denied. It is admitted, but there is an argument that despite all of that, we are all one and the same. We are the Russian nation. We are all Ruski, we are Russians. And what that means in practice is that the model is also taken from the 19th and 20th century, that if we are all Russian and Ruski, then the culture, and in particular the high culture, the education should be in Russian, exclusively in Russian. That's the model of the operation of the Russian Empire before 1917. This is the model that is used in the Russia-occupied parts of Ukraine, from the Crimea to Donbas republics, to the policies that we see now introduced in the occupied parts of the Ukrainian south, the oblasts of Kherson and Zaporizhzhia. Now, this idea of the three-partite nation, and here I'm showing you already the dissolution of the Soviet Union by the leaders of the three sister nations, of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, Boris Yeltsin, Stanislav Shushkevich of Belarus, and Leonid Kravchuk of Ukraine. So that image brings me to the new third part of my presentation, focusing on communism and communist experience, and where it left the region and how it contributes or doesn't contribute to the current war. Well, what you see is that the Bolsheviks did something that very few people actually expected that was possible. And I'm not talking about the survival of the Bolshevik Revolution again. There was a lot of skepticism that it would not survive. I have in mind something else. I have in mind an ability to piece together the Russian Empire that actually already had fell apart, like the Ottomans, like the Austro-Hungarians, but those empires really disappeared completely from the map of the world, being really fragmented into a number of the smaller places that were colored on the map or on the globe of the world in different colors. But most of what used to be the Russian Empire stayed on the map of the world where it used to be. It changed colors, but the color was still the same. And the Bolsheviks achieved that goal of rebuilding again the Russian Empire, and then even expanding its territory to a degree during World War II by doing two things. First was coercion, right? It was a military conquest and military control of the territory. That was one thing. Second one, it was like with the Imperial project of the 19th century, there was accommodation of different nations and different nationalisms. And if the Imperial project allowed Ukrainians and Belarusians to be a subgroups of a big Russian nation, the Bolshevik project had to deal already with much stronger and more mobilized Ukrainian and even Belarusian movements at that time. So the concession was of a different kind. The concession was that the existence of Ukraine and Belarus were recognized as separate republics. And more than that, Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus became one of the key founder and founding republics of the Soviet Union in 1922. According to Lenin's model, the Soviet Union, at least pro forma, recognized that those republics were equal, and that there was the all-Union center, which was not anymore Russian center. There was a lot of confusion. Russia was still running the Soviet Union. The capital was still the same, but there was one important development for Russia. First of all, for Russia, not even so much for Ukraine and Belarus. And that was the fact that with the creation of the Soviet Union, for the first time in history, Russia acquired borders and institutions that were different and separate from the borders and institutions of the empire or post-imperial state, the Soviet Union. So the foundations of the Boris Yeltsin's rise to power and revolt of the Russian Federation against the Union Center, which was represented by Mikhail Gorbachev, the prominent Soviet leader, the first president and the last president of the Soviet Union that just died recently. So that revolt would be impossible without what I call the Revolution of Nations in 1917, the formation of the Soviet Union, and not just recognition of Ukraine and Belarus as separate nations, but also endowing Russia with the territory and the borders and the institutions, which would be different from the borders, territory, and institutions of the Soviet Union. What happened during the Soviet time and the Soviet period? There was again the same interplay between coercion and accommodation. So the coercion comes in the form of the, as I already said, the military conquest originally. The Ukrainian famine of 1932-1933, which was certainly interpreted in Moscow as a policy not aimed only at the collectivization, extraction of grain from the peasantry, but also as an attack on what was considered at that time to be a Ukrainian nationalism. We know that from Stalin's pronouncements, we know that from the documents that were signed by Joseph Stalin at that time. Now, if you go back to where I started, and that was the article by Vladimir Putin, you clearly see there, and also in his de facto declaration of war on Ukraine in February of 22, a long speech that was dubbed history lecture. You see how unhappy and dissatisfied he was with the Soviet legacy in general. And you probably remember his argument that the Bolsheviks, the Lenin in particular, allegedly created Ukraine. So the reference was really to the accommodation that the Bolsheviks had to do in order to piece together the empire, the former imperial space, and then keep it going. What that article and that dissatisfaction with the Soviet nationality policy also suggested was that Putin was rejecting the Soviet policy. It was rejecting the very idea of the recognizing of nations of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus as separate, and also that he was really embracing and going back to the pre-Soviet or imperial part. One thing that very interesting about the Soviet collapse is the importance of Ukraine in that entire story. The Soviet Union was dissolved. That photo was taken on December 8th of 1991, and that was exactly 1 week after a referendum in Ukraine, where more than 92% of those who took part in the referendum voted for independence of Ukraine. So the question that the Ukrainians answered when they went to the polling stations was not whether they wanted the Soviet Union to continue or not. The question was whether they supported the decision of their parliament to declare Ukrainian independence. That decision was made immediately after the coup in August of 1991. So Ukrainians said, we want Ukraine to leave the Soviet Union. There was no question, no opinion on what should happen with the rest of the Soviet Union. And Ukraine was the only republic in the USSR where a referendum on independence was held. But that referendum and that answer to a very specific question eventually was translated into the decision to dissolve the Soviet Union. And the reason for that is the importance of Ukraine in the Soviet and then post-Soviet history of the region. The biggest troublemakers in terms of rising the banner of the national resistance for the Russian Empire were not Ukrainians. Those were the Poles. And they left the Russian Empire during World War I and then the revolutionary upheaval that followed from it. In terms of the troublemakers, they were replaced by the Ukrainians. So a lot of policy that was designed, nationality policy that was designed in the Soviet Union, was designed with an eye on Ukraine. Why? Ukrainians were the second largest ethnic group in the Soviet Union after the Russians, the second largest republic after Russia, and the second largest economy after Russia. And Yeltsin and people around him who were struggling in terms of the major economic crisis that hit the Soviet Union in the late 1980s and early 90s, they were looking at their own revenue coming from oil and gas, and they were looking at the demands of other republics. And the decision was very clear that without the second largest economy, Russia was not prepared to continue support the Soviet Union project, where especially they looked at the Central Asian republics, with the exception of Kazakhstan, the countries that needed help and assistance, and so on and so forth. So Yeltsin is looking for a different model, which would be of control over the post-Soviet space, that would be less costly for Russia. And that model becomes known as the Commonwealth of Independent States. A lot of what is happening today in the world in general, and in Russian policy in the post-Soviet space, Russian war on Ukraine, is attributed to Vladimir Putin. And there is a lot of reasons to do that. But one thing is something that really has its roots in the 1990s, and in the rule of Boris Yeltsin and people around him. Yeltsin probably would never start the war against Ukraine, but he certainly ordered, and more than once, Russian troops to fight in Chechnya. In terms of the post-Soviet space, Yeltsin thinking was to bring the post-Soviet republics back under the some form of Russian control using different instruments, not the restoration of the Soviet Union. So that's why you see the Commonwealth of Independent States, where Yeltsin was the leader, the leader for entire period when he was in power. You can look at the creation of the union between Russia and Belarus, the state that was declared but never really became a reality. What is different with Putin is basically an attempt to achieve the goals of the establishing Russian control over the post-Soviet space with the help of the military force. So that is a real contribution. Again, very, very, very dangerous and very, very sad contribution. Let me now move to the current war. And again, as I have already suggested, the war didn't start on February 24th, 2022. The war really started on February 27th of 2014, when the Russian special forces took over control over the building of the Crimean parliament and the Crimean government sector. And people like Igor Strelkov, the former FSB officer, and other paramilitary units that were dispatched to the Crimea, they dragged the deputies of the Crimean parliament from their apartments, from their houses, to the building of the parliament, forcing them to vote in particular way. So the same situation that is happening today with the sham referenda in occupied by Russia parts of Ukraine. The trigger for the war was Ukraine's insistence on signing the association agreement with the European Union. It wasn't the membership in the European Union, and it wasn't NATO. NATO was not on the horizon for Ukraine after 2008. So why the reaction from Russia and invasion of Ukraine came as a result of this Ukraine's insistence on the association agreement with the European Union. The reason was simple. If Ukraine signed association agreement with the European Union, it couldn't become part of the Eurasian Union that was promoted by Putin at that time. It was one of his visions of returning back to the third term as the Russian president. The Russian vision of the international relations as a whole was the vision of the multipolar world in which Russia, after establishing or re-establishing its some form of control over the post-Soviet space, military, political, economic, and otherwise, would be one of the poles on par with the European Union and China. So the idea was really to bring Ukraine into the form of union dominated and controlled by Russia. The idea was not to really take control over any part of Ukrainian territory at that time. But once, as the result of the Ukrainian Revolution of Dignity, Putin realized that his big Slavic or Eurasian project will not work in Ukraine, and its success really depended on Ukraine as the second largest post-Soviet republic and post-Soviet economy. He went for a different model, which I would call a greater Russia model, trying to go into Ukraine and grab parts of the Ukrainian territory. In the Crimea, settled mostly by the ethnic Russians, that was the majority of the population were ethnic Russians. But in Donbass and now in southern Ukraine, majority are the Ukrainians. But that's where the argument that Russians and Ukrainians are one and the same people, the imperial argument, is actually coming back and becomes a dominant one. We can talk also about, and the map really represents the current war, the Russian attempt to take over the Crimea, retreat from the Crimea, retreat from parts of Ukrainian territory near Kharkiv, south of Kharkiv, something that happened earlier this month, and attempt to hold on to the territories in the east and in the south of Ukraine. The renewal of the war happened again with the broader idea and broader agenda. Putin wanted to take over Kiev, the capital of Kievan Rus, according to the mythology, the cradle of the Russian nation, the place where the monument to Prince Volodymyr of Vladimir was built early in the mid-19th century, long before it was built in Moscow. But once the attempt to take over Crimea, and that means take over the entire Ukraine, failed, you see a default position which basically is the same. This is a greater Russia model that, again, now is based on the annexation, not only the Russian settled territories, but also the territories where the majority are the Ukrainians. The response to Putin's greater Russia model was very different in Ukraine in 2014 and 2022. If in 2014, Russia was able to destabilize the region and got enough support, at least from some sections of the population, none of that became possible and happened in 2022. Some of you maybe remember the videos of the Ukrainians marching with the banners against the Russian armored vehicles and tanks, barehanded really. And that footage that you saw was coming from Ukraine's east and south, where Russian is the majority, the Russian speakers in those cities that was wiped out from the face of the earth. It wasn't not only predominantly Russian-speaking city, but 44% of the population of the city before the war were ethnic Russians. So the continuing missile barrage of Kharkiv and destruction of the buildings, of the monuments, of people, destruction of people's life there. Again, another major industrial center on the border with Russia and mostly Russian speaking. One thing that happened in the middle of this war is really the death and the end of the all-Russian utopia that really was originated in the Imperial Russia, was returned to the center stage, political center stage by Putin with his article and the war, and really died, became one of the first victims of this war and out attacks. You see here the monument to the French, Russians and Ukrainians in downtown Kiev that survived until the start of this war in 2022. It had been removed, and this is the moment of interpretation of relations between Russians. Really concluding my fourth section of my presentation on the importance of history in the post-Soviet transition, and really its contribution into the current war and transformation of the historical mythology in the course of that war. One thing that I want to say in the conclusion is that perspective of the historian. My main emphasis were on the history of the region, on the history of Russia and Ukraine. But this war has a bigger significance. And it's really the end of the period of the post-Cold War era in the European and world history. It became very clear that the era of the end of the history that started in 1989 with the fall of the Berlin Wall, the peace dividend that came with that has been completely used. It came to an end. We are in a different era. We are in a different age. And people are talking more and more. And in that sense, again, history is back again. I want to thank you for your attention. And of course, I will be more than happy to answer whatever questions you may.
Serhii, unfortunately, your internet connection was going just out just a bit toward the end there. Can you just tell us again what that statue was in particular that you were showing there at the end?
Sure, absolutely. Well, the statue was a statue in downtown Kiev, very close to Maidan, which was installed in the 1980s, if I'm not mistaken, the last decade of the existence of the Soviet Union, and survived all the revolutions in Ukraine. The statue was, again, dedicated to the friendship between Russians and Ukrainians. The two figures at the center were unusually for that kind of monuments, not female figures, but male figures. So it was an older Russian brother and a younger Ukrainian brother. And in the background, there were different historical figures, including the Russian boyars who, together with Bogdan Khmelnytsky, participated in the first negotiation between Russia and Ukraine in Pereyaslav in 1654. That's when Russia took over Kiev. So the monument survived Ukrainian independence, two Maidans, two protests, but it didn't, and the first war, the start of the war in 2014, but it didn't survive this war. So it was removed, and what you saw there was a photograph that specifically captured that moment. It seems to me in March or maybe in April of this year when the monument was removed.
Fantastic, thanks, and thanks so much for this lecture, Serhii. You know, I'm listening and I'm realizing, you know, how much I have learned from you as I think about how many things you were talking about that I've actually tried to share in the non-public sessions with my students. And I realize it's because of reading your books, it's because of listening to lectures that you've done. And so you've been just incredibly influential on me, you know, in thinking about all of this. I'm going to ask you a general question before we launch into a lot of the specific questions. We have a bunch of them in the Q&A, and people can continue to submit there. I have other questions that my students submitted before the session today, but I want to ask one of my own, which is, you know, you're a prominent historian of Ukraine. Obviously, you're a professor at Harvard. How do you play a role as a historian in public discourse around Russia's war on Ukraine, you know, sort of trying to navigate between the need to counter the false histories in the narratives of someone like Putin or the narratives of Russian nationalists. But then can it be possible to still avoid an oversimplified counter narrative that itself may not express the full complexity of history as you see it as a professional historian? I thought your talk today was remarkable for actually trying to do that. But what I'm really curious about is for you to say just a bit more about our role as professional historians in the public sphere and how we can make our understanding of the past legible and useful in the present without compromising our efforts to complicate notions of the past that are frequently, of course, simplified for political uses.
Thank you. It is a challenge that certainly we face every day, especially when we get into the role of quote unquote public intellectual. And again, that is certainly what is expected from us, at least on a certain level. We have to communicate with not just with the academic community, not only with our colleagues. And we are doing that already as professors, right? Again, there are different levels of classes. We teach undergrads and we teach graduate students, and there is different level of complexity. So I think that talking to broader audiences and publics adds one more layer. But generally, I think the approach remains the same. In Ukraine, in the past, there was a very interesting debate among the historians because Ukrainian historians caught themselves between two different demands on them. One came from Ukraine becoming an independent state and forming a nation, and that nation needed a story, needed a history. On the other hand, those historians were already trying to engage with the outside world, European world, American world, where of course the national history was anathema, it was passé, it was something that belonged to the 19th century, a Rankian sort of history. And there were different solutions proposed. One of them was that, well, in reality, there are two histories. There are didactic history and there is academic history. and they don't talk to each other. So I certainly believe that there is one history, and it's the level of maybe complexity or how much we can expect from the audience of a given audience that is different. But other than that, I think the good knowledge, Harvard has this reference to good knowledge in its mission. The good knowledge, I believe, comes in a different forms and shapes, and the task is to try to figure out which form and which shape would work the best under the circumstances. But thanks again for this question. The challenge is always there.
So Zachary Sane, who's been in a number of my classes, actually, he's in my class right now. He's here in the audience today. He says, he asked if you could talk about how nationalism in Ukraine was able to continue or to survive through the oppression of the Ukrainian people, the coercion that you're talking about, those kind of things. How was it able to survive all of this?
Well, again, thank you. This is an excellent question. Again, right now I'm doing what I'm doing with every question. Trying to deal, Steve, with the question that you asked on how complex
right.
the answer can be.
I know you could talk about this for 2 hours. So.
going back and forth. So I'll start with maybe simplified answer, but I hope that it just point in the right direction, and I can talk about that later more. So the very simple answer is that the Ukrainian national project survived in opposition to the state. So Ukraine didn't have a state for most of its modern history. Mm-hmm. The way to survive was actually either to resist the state directly or to find modus vivendi with the state that would allow some form of autonomy. But always the state was the other, and the state was the enemy, right? So if the state prohibits you teaching and getting education in Ukrainian, if the state prohibits you publishing in Ukrainian, if the state goes after you and puts you on trial for having a Ukrainian national flag, blue and yellow, that's exactly what is happening now in the occupied parts of Ukraine. Right. Finding the Ukrainian national flag in the apartment is sufficient reason for the Russian guard officers to take you to the basement, as they say, so basically to a makeshift prison. So that's in terms of the very generally how it survived. You self-organize, and you're very suspicious and you're careful vis-a-vis the state. And that meant that Ukrainians actually had a very difficult time after 1991 to come to the terms, to grasp the idea that the state is not necessarily the other, that the state is not necessarily the oppressor, that the state can actually be there to protect you. And this change really dramatically started to happen only after the Russian aggression in 2014. And certainly came to the fore now after 2022, where Ukrainians look at the state, look at the army, not anymore as the forms of oppressor by the far away capitals and forces, but as something that is theirs and that will protect them. So again, it's on the one hand more narrow answer than maybe you expected, but it's also a little bit broader. But the point is, you do that in opposition to the state. You do that by self-organizing, or you're doing that by some form of corrupting the state to allow your publications. The very interesting stories about this prohibition in the 19th century and the publications. It didn't function 100% the way how empire wanted it to function because some of the censors were taking bribes.
That's great. And this really actually leads into sort of a number of questions that my students submitted before you were going to come today. And actually, it's to think forward from here, to think a little bit about what happens after this war. There are a lot of people who report a remarkable consolidation of a Ukrainian civic nationalism. Just, I think, what you're talking about since 2014, especially since February of this year. And so I like Tyler DeSimbrino in my class asked, what do you think the long-term impact on Ukrainian identity will be from the conflict? Another student asks about what you see as perhaps the role of a more radical nationalism after the war. What can the past tell us about how, after the war is over, Ukraine deals with potential divisions maybe that the war is creating? So there's a whole slew of different kinds of questions, and I'll just kind of let you attack this how you want. But it's just kind of to think if this war has been really critical in creating a sense of identity, what happens when we all hope this war goes away?
Sure. Well, great questions. And sometimes I joke that we historians predicting the past, so asking us to predict the future is again maybe asking a little bit too much. But I will try. I will try certainly to share my thoughts on that, because I believe that history is really the only instrument that we have to predict the future. So it's maybe paradoxical, but that's what I believe. And history, in a sense of parallels, comparing to the other situations against similar situations. So one thing in terms of the impact of the war on the Ukrainian identity. We don't know how the war ends, where the borders will be. But one thing that became clear already maybe 1 week or 2 weeks after the start of this recent invasion, Ukraine is there to stay. So the idea to just destroy the state altogether, to turn Ukrainians into the Russians, will not succeed. That's already clear. Ukraine is victorious already there and was already after the first two weeks, the most difficult weeks of the resistance. It's also very clear, and I was trying to articulate that in many words and images, that the project of the pan-Russian nation, the big Russian nation, is dead. It's dead not only in Ukraine, but also it's dead in Russia, because after that kind of war, that kind of atrocities, that kind of loss of life also on the Russian side, it will be difficult for Russians to buy again into the narrative that the Ukrainians are really Russians who were captured by the Nazis, who were led by a Jewish president called Volodymyr Zelensky. So war is a major contributor factor to the formation of a separate Ukrainian identity and separate Russian identity. Now, what Ukraine had shown since 2014 is that it responds to the Russian challenge about its identity and nationhood, not in the way the Russia actually wanted to respond. Because the Russian argument, when they went into the Crimea and in Donbass in 2014, when they went into Kherson and Zaporizhia region in 2022, was, if you speak Russian, you are really Russian, and your loyalty should be to Russia. And Ukraine survived by saying, no, this is not about language. We can speak Russian, and half of the army is fighting in Russian against the Russian aggression. Ethnic Russians are in that army fighting. This is not about language, and this is not about religion, and this is not about culture. This is about our political culture, our institutions, our sense of identity. It's about democracy at the end. Again, it sounds like oversimplification, but it's very true that this war is also the war and conflict about democracy and autocracy. The people on the front lines really believe that they are there to defend their right to elect the officials, to decide what their life could be and should be. The Ukrainian social networks are in the shock not only because of the war, they are in the shock because they don't understand how the Russians actually are so passive and are unable to defend themselves against the regime and against the state. Because deep down, the assumption is, okay, they're like us, but why they don't behave like us? And again, that's the biggest second shock after the Russian invasion. The second shock is that the Russians in Russia not behave like Ukrainians behaved at during the Orange Revolution at Maidan in terms of self-mobilization and so on and so forth. Now, whether this multi-religious, multi-ethnic, lingual model of the Ukrainian nation will survive the war. My guess, it will survive. I also pretty sure that the importance of the Ukrainian language and Ukrainian culture in the Ukrainian identity as such, in the model of Ukrainian identity, will increase. It increased since 2014, and it increases now with especially younger generation Russian speakers switching consciously to Ukrainian. And again, this evidence is still anecdotal, but it's real. Hopefully at some point we'll have polling data to look exactly what is happening there. The radical nationalism. A lot was made out of radical nationalism in terms of justification of the war from the Russian side. From the academic perspective, what I can tell you, the radical Ukrainian nationalism is certainly there. But the biggest question for me is not about how much influence it has on the Ukrainian politics, but why it actually has almost no influence. I'll explain what I mean. In the Ukrainian parliament that was elected already after the war in 2014, and then the second time after President Zelensky once retreat. There is no representation of any nationalist party. The reason is very simple. None of them passed the 5% barrier to get into the parliament. And they were not there before. So we look at France, where they were close to capturing presidency. We look at Hungary, we look at Poland. The question is why in the middle of the war, Ukraine has radical nationalism that is so underrepresented. There can be different answers to that, a special discussion, but that's the reality about the importance of the radical nationalism in Ukraine. It is there, it is present, but it is marginal in terms of the political map, political scene of the country. What will come next? Again, I am pretty sure that Ukraine, despite everything, will emerge from this ordeal as a democracy, more mature democracy. It will remain to be quite diverse in terms of its regions, in terms of historical trajectories, languages. I'm talking about that as a historian, knowing the different parts of Ukraine belonged historically to different empires, states, political systems, and things like that. This is a historical foundation of Ukrainian democracy, and that will not disappear. So, in that sense, I'm quite optimistic that the democracy will survive, and that the pluralistic nature of Ukrainian identity will survive as well, with the increase of the Ukrainian linguistic and cultural component. That's my prediction, at least.
Serhii, this was absolutely fantastic. There are so many more questions. We could keep you for hours to continue to talk. I know you have somebody coming tomorrow who might seem like a little bigger personality than me. I'm sure at the end of the week, after you look back and you think, I talked to Professor Barnes at George Mason and I talked to President Zelensky, that I'm the one you're going to remember. But we really appreciate you being here. This was so rich. I appreciate all the work that you do. I appreciate all of the interviews that you give, the lectures that you give. Again, I can't tell you how much I have personally learned from you. I want to take a minute.
If I can jump in, Stephen, thank you very much again for this invitation and for this conclusion. I can assure you that I will remember our conversation this week more than conversation with President Zelensky, because it will not be me who will be moderating the event. I am just someone who is behind the scenes. So again, thanks again.
Fair enough. And thank you again for coming. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Please join us again next week and for the next now 9 consecutive Mondays that we're going to continue to go. Next week, we have Steven Siegel from the University of Texas at Austin. He's doing an absolutely phenomenal job of documenting the war on Twitter. And he's going to talk about that and the creation of what he calls the February 24th archive when he joins us next week. Please also, I know there are so many questions that we didn't get a chance to ask and to answer. This is why we're going to have some events on Fridays at 3 o'clock. Please check the George Mason University Russian Eurasian Studies website for more information on those. I put that in the chat for you as well. Professor Cynthia Hooper from the College of the Holy Cross and I will take questions from the audience. We're going to actually have the opportunity for you to open your mics and to speak. And hopefully we can get to more of the many burning questions that so many people have. I'm so gratified to see so many people coming to these events. It means a tremendous amount to me that all of you continue to have interest in talking about and thinking about this war. Please continue to share this with your friends, share it with your colleagues, with your students. Ask them to come, ask them to join us to be part of these conversations. You can also look for the YouTube channel for Russian and Eurasian Studies at George Mason University, where you'll find recordings of all of these events that you can share as well. So thank you, everybody, for joining us today, and I'll see everybody back here in 1 week.